"Can I stay here just for tonight?" asked the single mom to the neighborhood's most feared mafia boss. What he said next will leave you breathless and change their lives forever. Welcome back to the family, everyone. We are so incredibly grateful to have you here in our circle of story lovers. Before we dive into this chilling and heart-pounding journey of Vanessa and Max, please take a moment to join our family by hitting that subscribe button, giving us a like, and sharing this video with someone who needs to feel the warmth of a great story today. We love hearing from you, so please comment below and tell us which part of the world you are watching from so we can welcome you personally to our global community. The snowstorm came without warning. Just hours earlier, the neighborhood had been cold but manageable until the wind picked up and the sky turned a blinding white. Within minutes, power lines fell, and the entire street disappeared into a suffocating darkness. There was no heat, no light, and no phone signal to call for the help that Vanessa Pagani so desperately needed. Inside her small, aging apartment, the temperature continued to fall as the blizzard struck with a violence that felt personal. Vanessa was a woman built of scar tissue and iron, a mother who usually endured through fatigue with a steadiness in her eyes that only a woman fighting for her child could carry. But tonight, fear had dimmed even that light. She held her young daughter, Jade, tightly against her chest, feeling the little girl's body trembling with more than just the creeping cold. Vanessa's eyes flicked again and again to the dead heater and the windows now lined with thick frost. The familiar, terrifying whistle of an asthma attack began to fill the room, a wheeze that sounded like dry leaves scraping together. Jade let out a weak, ragged cough and curled deeper into her mother's chest. Vanessa had used the last of the rescue inhaler, but the biting chill was a trigger that no medicine could stop. She realized with a jolt of pure panic that her nebulizer, the only thing that could truly open Jade's lungs, was nothing more than a plastic paperweight without electricity. Jade's breathing was becoming shallow and labored, her small fingers clinging to Vanessa's collar as if she understood the life-or-death urgency of the moment. Something inside Vanessa shifted, her fear transforming into a different kind of fuel. She pulled on her worn coat, slid boots over her feet, and bundled Jade into the thickest duvet she owned. She knew she couldn't stay. To wait for morning was to risk everything. She opened the front door, and the cold slapped her like a wall of ice, the snow whipping sideways in a wind that bit into her cheeks, stepping into the deep drifts. Each stride felt heavy as she whispered promises into Jade's ear, begging her to just keep breathing. Through the swirling white chaos, she saw it. The Caruso estate at the end of the block. It rose out of the shadows like a stone fortress, lit from within by a golden light that glowed behind thick, reinforced curtains. It was a modern, sleek house that stood out as an expensive anomaly in their tired neighborhood. People in the neighborhood whispered about its occupant, Max Caruso, a man with ink on his throat and a reputation for blood. They crossed the street just to avoid his gaze. But Vanessa didn't care about the rumors or the danger anymore. Her heart pounded against her ribs. What if he turned them away? She reached the porch, her hand hovering over the door in a moment of agonizing hesitation before she finally hammered against the oak. It opened faster than she expected. A wall of cedar-scented heat flooded out, brushing her face with a comfort she hadn't felt in hours. Standing there was Max, tall and broad-shouldered, his expression alert, and his eyes moving past her straight to the gasping child in her arms. "I'm so sorry," Vanessa said, her voice breathless and trembling with a mixture of cold and terror. "My daughter, she can't breathe. No heat, no power. Can we just stay here for tonight to keep her warm?" A long second passed as she looked into the eyes of the man the world told her to fear. Then, without a word, Max Caruso stepped aside and opened the door wide. "Come in," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. "Let's get her warm first." The wind shrieked like a banshee as Vanessa tightened the knot of the duvet around Jade. creating a cocoon of fabric that felt far too thin against the murderous chill of the night. Every instinct in her body screamed to stay hidden in the dark of her apartment, but the sound of Jade's struggle, the wet, whistling gasp for air that wouldn't come, overrode every ounce of her own self-preservation. She tucked her daughter into the crook of her arm, feeling the heat of the girl's panic radiating through the layers of wool, and stepped over the threshold into a world that had turned into a white abyss. The snow didn't just fall. It attacked, swirling in chaotic patterns that blinded her the moment she stepped off the porch. Her boots sank deep into the fresh powder, each step a Herculean effort that burned her lungs and threatened to topple her. Through the haze of the blizzard, the Caruso estate stood like a silent, predatory watcher at the end of the street, its high stone walls and wrought iron gates barely visible through the thick curtain of white. Vanessa's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, not just from the exertion, but from the realization of whose door she was about to knock on. Max Caruso was a name whispered in grocery store aisles and over backyard fences, a man whose presence in their neighborhood felt like a dark cloud that everyone simply learned to live under without ever looking directly at. They said he was the ghost of the city's underworld, a man who had built a kingdom on silence and steel, and here she was, a woman with nothing but a dying flashlight and a suffocating child, walking straight into the lion's den. She reached the iron gates, which groaned under the weight of the ice as she pushed them just wide enough to slip through. The walk up the long, winding driveway felt like an eternity, the wind whipping her dark hair across her face like lashes. She looked down at Jade, whose eyes were wide and glazed with a terrifying exhaustion, her small hands clutching Vanessa's coat with the last of her strength. "Almost there, my love," Vanessa sobbed, the words stolen by the wind before they could even reach her daughter's ears. She reached the massive oak doors of the mansion, their dark grain looking like ancient skin under the flicker of the emergency security lights. For a heartbeat, she froze. She thought of the stories of men who entered this house and were never seen again, of the cold ruthlessness that supposedly flowed through Max Caruso's veins. But then Jade let out a sound. A tiny, broken whimper for air, and the mother in Vanessa obliterated the coward. She didn't just knock. She used her entire weight to hammer against the wood, a desperate, rhythmic plea for mercy that echoed over the howling storm. The door didn't creak. It moved with a heavy, expensive silence that caught her off guard. The heat hit her first, a thick, intoxicating wave of cedar and sandalwood that felt like a physical embrace. Then, she saw him. Max Caruso stood in the center of the frame, his presence so massive it seemed to shrink the vaulted foyer behind him. He was dressed in a black silk shirt, the top buttons undone to reveal the intricate, dark ink of a hawk's wings stretching across his collarbone and disappearing toward his throat. His face was a mask of cold, sharp angles, his eyes flashing with a predatory alertness that softened into a lethal focus when they landed on her. As he moved slightly, the light caught the dull glint of a leather holster tucked against his ribs, a silent reminder of the world he commanded. Vanessa's breath hitched, her voice failing her as she stared up at the man everyone feared. "Please," she managed to choke out, her voice a ragged thread. "My daughter, she can't breathe. The power, the cold." She didn't even finish the sentence before Max's gaze shifted. His eyes didn't linger on Vanessa's disheveled appearance or her frozen face. They dropped instantly to the small, gasping bundle in her arms. In that split second, the devil of the city vanished. His brow furrowed, a flicker of something primal and protective crossing his features. Without a single word of interrogation or a moment of hesitation, he stepped back, swinging the heavy door wide to invite the storm's victims into his sanctuary. He reached out a hand. A large, calloused hand covered in the ink of his history, and gently guided her inward, closing the door on the freezing world and locking the blizzard outside. "Get her to the fire," he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that carried the weight of an absolute promise. I'll handle the rest. The heavy door clicked shut, severing the connection to the frozen world outside, and leaving the howling wind as nothing more than a muffled ghost against the thick stone walls. Inside, the air was a different element entirely, rich, still, and heavy with the scent of expensive leather and wood smoke. Vanessa stood in the center of the foyer, her boots leaking melted snow onto the polished marble floors, feeling as though she had stepped into another dimension. The house was a temple of modern architecture and brutalist luxury. High, vaulted ceilings disappeared into the shadows, and every piece of furniture looked like a work of art, cold and perfect. Yet, despite the sterile beauty of the marble and glass, the house was humming. While the rest of the neighborhood lay dead and dark, Max Caruso's fortress lived. Max didn't waste time with pleasantries or the shock of her intrusion. He moved with a predatory efficiency that was both terrifying and deeply comforting. He caught Vanessa's gaze for a fraction of a second, his dark eyes scanning the pallor of her face before locking onto the shivering duvet in her arms. "The living room," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that brooked no argument. He led her into a sunken lounge where a massive fireplace occupied an entire wall, the flames already roaring with a ferocity that suggested they had been waiting for them. He pointed to a sprawling, deep-seated sofa made of buttery Italian leather. "Put her down. Strip off the wet blankets." As Vanessa peeled away the damp layers, the sound of Jade's struggle became the only thing that mattered in the vast room. The girl's chest was heaving, her small throat working desperately to pull in the oxygen that the cold had stolen. Max disappeared for a moment, his footsteps silent on the rugs, only to return with a heavy, industrial-grade portable generator. With movements that were surprisingly steady for a man whose hands were built for violence, he knelt on the floor. He didn't ask where the medicine was. He reached into Vanessa's bag, pulled out the nebulizer kit, and plugged it into the humming machine. The mechanical drone of the generator was the most beautiful sound Vanessa had ever heard. As the mist began to swirl in the plastic mask, Max handed it to her, his tattooed fingers grazing hers. The contrast was startling. His skin was burning hot, while hers felt like shards of ice. He watched in a heavy, observant silence as Vanessa pressed the mask to Jade's face, coaching her daughter through the rhythmic gasps until the medication began to take hold. Slowly, the terrifying whistle in Jade's lungs began to fade, replaced by the steady, rhythmic sound of a child finally finding peace. "She's breathing," Vanessa whispered, a sob finally breaking through the iron wall of her composure. She collapsed back against the leather, the sheer exhaustion of the night finally catching up to her. She looked up and realized Max was standing by the window, his silhouette framed by the flickering firelight. He looked like a king surveying a battlefield, the ink on his neck dark against the pale moonlight reflecting off the snow outside. He had a glass of amber liquid in one hand, but he wasn't drinking. He was watching the driveway. "Sleep," Max said, not turning around. "The house is secure. The perimeter is monitored." Vanessa wanted to protest, to say she couldn't possibly rest in the home of a man the world feared, but the warmth of the fire and the rhythmic rise and fall of Jade's chest were a powerful sedative. She watched him from the shadows of the couch. This man who was supposed to be a monster, yet had moved mountains to save a child he didn't know. Max didn't move from his post. He pulled a chair toward the foyer, positioning himself where he could see both the main entrance and the woman and child on his sofa. Throughout the long, dark hours of the soul, Vanessa would drift in and out of a shallow sleep. Every time her eyes fluttered open, she saw the same sight. Max Caruso, sitting in the dim light, his broad shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on the door. He was a silent sentinel, a gargoyle guarding his gate. He didn't sleep. He didn't look tired. He sat with a coiled tension, his hand never far from the holster at his side, ensuring that while the storm raged and the world froze, nothing, not the cold, not the shadows, and certainly no man, would cross that threshold to hurt the two lives he had claimed as his responsibility for the night. In the silence of the fortress, Vanessa realized that the most dangerous man in the city was the only reason her heart was still beating. The first rays of dawn were not golden, but a pale, filtered silver that struggled to pierce through the thick curtains of the Caruso estate. The storm outside had settled into a rhythmic, hushed pulse of falling snow, but inside the great room, the air remained unervingly still. Vanessa stirred from her restless sleep, her neck stiff against the expensive leather, her eyes immediately darting to the bundle beside her. Jade was still asleep, but the terrifying, ragged whistle in her chest had smoothed out into a soft, steady hum. The girl's color had returned, her cheeks no longer the ghostly blue of the previous night, but a faint, healthy pink that Vanessa's gaze then traveled to the armchair by the door. Max was exactly where he had been hours ago. He hadn't changed his position. His back was straight, his dark eyes alert and fixed on the perimeter monitors that glowed softly on a side table. He looked like a man who was unfamiliar with the concept of rest, a sentinel who viewed the world as a series of threats to be managed. The early light caught the sharp lines of his jaw and the intricate, dark patterns of the ink that climbed his throat, making him look more like a myth than a man. Jade stirred, her small hand reaching out to find Vanessa's arm. She blinked her large, dark eyes, taking in the vaulted ceilings and the dying embers of the fireplace with a child's quiet wonder. She didn't seem afraid. Instead, she looked curious, her gaze drifting until it landed on the tall, dark figure sitting across from them. Max didn't move, but his focus shifted. The cold, calculating intensity he used to watch the door flickered, replaced by a sudden, uncertain stillness as the little girl sat up. With the fear of the previous night forgotten in the safety of the warmth, Jade slid off the couch. Before Vanessa could reach for her, the little girl padded across the thick Persian rug in her mismatched socks. She stopped right in front of Max, looking up at him with the fearless honesty that only a 4-year-old possesses. Max stared back, his hands, large, scarred, and covered in the dark art of his past, gripping the armrests of his chair. Jade tilted her head, her eyes locked on the dark markings at his collarbone. Slowly, she reached out a tiny, delicate finger and pointed toward the ink on his neck. "Is that a dragon?" she whispered, her voice tiny but clear in the vast room. The silence that followed was heavy. Vanessa held her breath, her heart hammering as she waited for the man everyone feared to rebuff the child. But the shadow that usually lived in Max's expression seemed to break. A soft, genuine light touched his eyes, and the corner of his mouth quirked upward. It wasn't the smirk of a predator or the grimace of a businessman. It was a real smile, the first one Vanessa had ever seen on his face. "Close," Max replied, his voice a low, gentle rumble that lacked its usual bite. "It's a hawk. He's there to watch over things." "He looks brave," Jade decided. Nodding solemnly, Max's smile widened just a fraction, a look of profound surprise crossing his features as if he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as anything other than a monster. He looked up at Vanessa, and for a fleeting second, the wall between them felt thinner. He stood up, his massive frame towering over them once again, but the lethal tension had dissipated. "You need to eat," he stated, the command returning to his voice, though it was now laced with an odd kind of hospitality. He tapped a button on an intercom near the door. When a soft voice answered, he didn't bark an order. He simply spoke with the quiet authority of a man who was used to being obeyed. "Elena, we have guests. Prepare a full breakfast in the dining room. Make sure there's something the little one likes. Pancakes, fruit, and coffee. Strong." He looked back at Vanessa, his dark eyes unreadable once more. "The maid will have everything ready in 20 minutes. There are guest bathrooms down the hall if you wish to freshen up. Everything you need is there. As he turned to lead them toward the dining wing, Jade reached out and boldly grabbed two of his tattooed fingers with her small hand. Max froze for a heartbeat, his entire body tensing at the unexpected contact. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, he relaxed his hand, allowing the small child to lead the devil of the city down his own hallway. Vanessa followed behind, her mind reeling. She had come to his door looking for a place to hide from the storm, but as she watched the hardened Mafia boss adjust his stride to match a toddler's, she realized the most dangerous thing in this house wasn't the guns or the man. It was the heart he was trying so hard to hide. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world draped in a deceptive, sparkling white silence. After a breakfast that felt more like a dream than a reality, Vanessa found herself standing on the threshold of the Caruso estate once more. The transition from the scent of expensive cedar and high-end security back into the biting reality of the street was jarring. Max had barely spoken as they left. He had simply stood by the massive oak door, his shadow long and imposing, his dark eyes tracking them until they reached the edge of his property. Vanessa walked back to her aging apartment building with Jade's small hand tucked firmly into hers, her mind swirling with the image of the man everyone feared smiling at a 4-year-old's question about a dragon. The walk back felt different. The neighborhood was still reeling from the blackout, neighbors digging out their cars with exhausted expressions. But as Vanessa approached her own front door, a strange sense of unease settled in her gut. She remembered the panic of the night before. The way she had slammed the door in her haste, the wood splintering slightly against the frame because the old lock had finally given way under the pressure of the wind and her own desperation. She expected to find the door ajar, the interior of her home as frozen as the sidewalk. Instead, when she reached for the handle, it didn't jiggle or groan. She looked down and gasped, her breath hitching in the cold air. The old, rusted deadbolt that had been a source of anxiety for months was gone. In its place was a sleek, heavy-duty chrome lock, professional-grade and shimmering with a lethal sort of polish. The wood around the frame had been reinforced with a steel plate, so perfectly installed that it looked like it had always been there. There was no bill, no invoice, and no sign of a handyman. There was only the silent, undeniable evidence of power. Vanessa pushed the door open, her heart skipping a beat as the warmth of her apartment hit her. The power had returned to the block, but it wasn't just the heat that felt different. On the small, chipped kitchen table sat a large, heavy wooden crate. It wasn't a grocery bag from the local discount mart. It was a box made of dark slats, filled to the brim with things Vanessa usually walked past in the specialty aisle. There were glass jars of organic honey, thick cuts of premium meats wrapped in butcher paper, fresh berries that shouldn't have been available in a blizzard, and boxes of high-quality pasta that cost more than her hourly wage. At the very top sat a new, high-end nebulizer kit, still in its plastic wrapping, alongside a stack of specialized filters. She walked around the table, her fingers trembling as she searched for a card, a name, or even a scribbled, "You're welcome." But there was nothing. The silence of the gift was more profound than any note could have been. It was shadow protection, a declaration of care from a man who lived in the dark. Vanessa looked out her window, her gaze drifting across the street to the stone fortress at the end of the block. She couldn't see him, but she felt his presence as surely as she felt the weight of the new key in her pocket. Jade reached into the crate, pulling out a container of oversized, glistening strawberries with a cry of delight. Vanessa watched her daughter, the fear that had defined her life for so long beginning to shift into something else, something warmer, yet far more dangerous. She knew exactly who had done this. She knew that by accepting these gifts, she was no longer just a neighbor in a tired neighborhood. She was now under the gaze of the hawk. The devil of the city hadn't just given them a night of warmth. He had quietly reached out and tightened his grip on her world, And for the first time in her life, Vanessa didn't want to run from the man in the shadows. She sat down at the table, a single tear tracing a path through the dried salt of the storm on her cheek, knowing that her life had been irrevocably claimed by a silent benefactor. The heavy, chrome key felt like a lead weight in Vanessa's pocket as she stepped out into the biting afternoon air. Across the street, the Caruso estate loomed, its dark stone walls absorbing the pale winter light. She couldn't sit in her kitchen and stare at that crate of expensive food anymore. She couldn't look at the reinforced lock on her door without feeling the invisible thread that now connected her life to his. Independence had been her only armor for years, the only thing that kept her standing when the world tried to grind her down, and the weight of Max's silent charity felt like it was crushing that armor into dust. She saw his sleek, black SUV idling in the long driveway, the exhaust pluming into the cold air like dragon's breath. Max was standing by the driver's side door, dressed in a charcoal overcoat that made him look like a shadow cast against the snow. He was on his phone, his posture rigid, the ink on his neck peeking out from beneath his collar. Vanessa didn't give herself time to hesitate. She marched across the slush-covered asphalt, her breath hitching in her chest, and reached the edge of his property just as he clicked his phone shut. Max looked up, his dark eyes narrowing as he watched her approach. He didn't move, didn't smile, and didn't offer a greeting. He simply waited, a statue of a man who moved the world with a whisper. Vanessa stopped a few feet away, her hands trembling in her coat pockets. "The lock," she started, her voice sounding thin against the vastness of his estate. "The food. The nebulizer. I saw it all, Max." Max's expression remained a mask of obsidian. "It was necessary," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air between them. "Necessary for who?" Vanessa countered, her voice rising with a mix of gratitude and a fierce, desperate pride. "I've spent 4 years making sure I don't owe anyone anything. I work 2 jobs so I can look my daughter in the eye and tell her we made it on our own. I can't pay for those things, Max. I can't pay for a luxury security system or a crate of food that costs more than my rent. I can't pay you back, and I won't be a project for a man like you." The silence that followed was suffocating. A gust of wind whipped between them, pulling at Vanessa's hair and biting at her skin, but she didn't flinch. She stared into the eyes of the Mafia boss, expecting anger, expecting him to demand his due, or perhaps to laugh at her small-town defiance. Instead, Max took a single step toward her. The movement was slow, deliberate, and carried a weight that made the air feel thick. He stopped just inches from her, his presence towering, the scent of cedar and expensive tobacco enveloping her. He looked down at her, his gaze so intense it felt like he was reading the very marrow of her bones. His dark eyes searched hers, tracing the exhaustion, the fear, and the stubborn fire that had brought her to his door in the first place. "You think this is about a debt?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, velvet whisper. He reached out, his large, tattooed hand hovering near her face for a heartbeat before he tucked a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. His touch was unexpectedly warm, a stark contrast to the freezing wind. "You think I spent my morning making sure your door could withstand a battering ram because I wanted your money? Then why?" she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "Why do all of this for a stranger?" Max leaned in closer, his shadow falling over her completely. The coldness in his eyes didn't vanish, but it shifted, turning from the calculated gaze of a businessman into the fierce, territorial heat of a protector. "I've spent my entire life in a world where everything has a price," he said, the words vibrating with a raw, jagged honesty. "But when I saw you standing on my porch, holding that child and ready to face the devil himself just to keep her warm, I realized there are some things that are beyond currency." He held her gaze, his face inches from hers, the hawk on his neck appearing to pulse with every breath he took. "I didn't ask for payment, Vanessa," he said, his voice an absolute, ironclad promise. "I asked for you to be safe. And in this neighborhood, in this city, that is the only thing that matters. You don't owe me a dime. You owe it to that little girl to let someone stand guard for once." He didn't wait for her to respond. He stepped back, climbed into his vehicle, and drove away, leaving Vanessa standing alone in his driveway. She watched the red tail lights disappear into the gray afternoon, her hand rising to touch the spot on her ear where his fingers had grazed her skin. The armor of her independence hadn't just been crushed. It had been replaced by something far more terrifying. The realization that for the first time in her life, she was no longer fighting alone. The following week, the sky bruised into a deep, sickly purple as another front moved in, bringing a different kind of storm, one that didn't just carry ice, but a heavy, suffocating sense of dread. Vanessa tried to focus on the hum of the new heater and the sight of Jade coloring at the kitchen table with the expensive markers Max had sent over, but the air in the apartment felt thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out by an invisible vacuum. She kept checking the new chrome lock, running her thumb over the cold metal for comfort, but her skin crawled with the sensation of being watched. She had spent years running from the shadows of her ex-husband's life, a man who had traded his family's safety for gambling debts and back-alley promises, and she knew that while Max Caruso was a silent protector, the world she had escaped hadn't forgotten her face. The first blow didn't come from the wind. It was a heavy, metallic thud that shook the very frame of the building. Vanessa froze, her heart leaping into her throat as she lunged for Jade, pulling the girl into the narrow space between the refrigerator and the wall. "Stay quiet, baby," she hissed, her voice trembling as the second blow fell. This wasn't the desperate, frantic hammering of a mother in a blizzard. This was the calculated, rhythmic violence of someone coming to collect a soul. The reinforced steel plate Max had installed groaned, the heavy-duty lock holding firm, but the wooden frame of the aging apartment began to splinter under the sheer force of a sledgehammer. With a final, sickening crack of wood, the door didn't just open, it exploded inward. A man stepped through the wreckage, his silhouette framed by the flickering hallway light. He was a jagged contrast to the refined power of Max Caruso. He was greasy, smelling of cheap tobacco and old sweat, with eyes that held the dull, flat cruelty of a shark. In his hand, he swung a heavy iron bar, the tip scraping against the linoleum floor with a screech that set Vanessa's teeth on edge. "Vanessa Pagani," he rasped, his voice a jagged edge. "Your husband owes a lot of people a lot of money. Since he's gone to ground, I figure it's time his wife started paying the interest." Vanessa stood her ground, her body acting as a physical shield for Jade, who was whimpering silently behind her. She reached for the heavy cast-iron skillet on the stove, her knuckles white, her breath coming in short, panicked stabs. "He's not my husband anymore," she spat, her voice cracking but fierce. "And I don't have your money. Get out before I call the police." The man laughed, a dry, rattling sound that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped deeper into the kitchen, his boots crunching over the splinters of her door. "Police don't come to this block on nights like this, sweetheart. And besides, I'm not here for a check anymore. I think I'll take something else to settle the debt. Maybe that pretty little girl behind you." He raised the iron bar, his muscles coiling as he prepared to lunge. Vanessa felt the cold wall behind her, the realization sinking in that she was cornered, trapped in the very home Max had tried to make a fortress. She gripped the skillet, ready to fight a losing battle, her eyes darting to the window where the snow continued to fall, silent and indifferent to the violence about to unfold in the dark. The intruder took another step, the iron bar whistling through the air as he tapped it against the kitchen table, a predatory grin spreading across his face as he watched the light of hope die in Vanessa's eyes. In that moment of absolute terror, Vanessa realized that even the strongest lock couldn't stop a monster who was already at the throat. and the only thing louder than the thumping of her heart was the terrifying silence of the street outside. The intruder's hand tightened around the iron bar, his knuckles white and scarred. But just as he pivoted to strike, the world outside Vanessa's shattered door erupted. A sudden, blinding strobe of crimson and blue light slashed through the dark kitchen, reflecting off the falling snow like a siren's scream. It wasn't the police. It was the high-frequency security response of the Caruso estate. The intruder barely had time to blink before a shadow eclipsed the doorway. A presence so immense and so cold that the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 more degrees. Max Caruso didn't enter the room. He invaded it. He looked like a god of vengeance. His charcoal overcoat flared behind him, his dark eyes burning with a lethal, focused clarity. He didn't say a word. He didn't issue a warning. The intruder swung the iron bar with a desperate, panicked grunt, but Max moved with a fluid, terrifying speed that made the other man look like he was moving through water. Max caught the man's wrist in a grip that sounded like dry wood snapping. The iron bar clattered to the floor, forgotten, as Max drove his shoulder into the man's chest, pinning him against the refrigerator with a force that dented the metal. The violence that followed was swift, efficient, and devastatingly quiet. There were no cinematic threats, only the muffled sounds of a predator dismantling a threat. Max's movements were precise. A sharp strike to the solar plexus, a heavy knee that sent the intruder to the floor, and a final, crushing grip on the man's throat that squeezed the very air from his lungs. Vanessa watched, frozen, her hands over Jade's ears, as the man who had terrified her was reduced to a whimpering heap at the feet of the Mafia boss. Max leaned down, his voice a low, terrifying silkiness as he whispered something into the intruder's ear that turned the man's face a ghostly, translucent gray. With one hand, Max dragged the man toward the shattered doorway and shoved him into the hallway, where two of Max's silent, suited men were already waiting to erase the trash from the building. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of Vanessa's ragged breathing. Max turned back toward the kitchen, the lethal tension in his frame slowly coiling back into a forced composure. His knuckles were bruised, and the hawk on his neck seemed to pulse in the flickering light, but his eyes were no longer on the doorway. They were on Vanessa. He scanned her from head to toe, looking for a scratch, a bruise, anything that would justify more violence. When he saw she was physically unharmed, his gaze moved to Jade, who was peeking out from behind Vanessa's legs with wide, shimmering eyes. Max didn't offer a hand to help her up, and he didn't offer words of comfort. His protective instinct had turned into something harder, something more permanent. He looked at the splintered door frame, the cheap linoleum, and the thin walls that had failed to protect the only things he had found worth guarding in years. The devil of the city took a deep breath, his chest expanding under his coat, and he looked at Vanessa with an intensity that brooked no defiance. "I told you the first time I met you that I asked for you to be safe," he said, his voice an ironclad rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "This place is no longer a home, it's a target, and I don't leave my responsibilities in the line of fire." Vanessa opened her mouth to argue, to claim her independence one last time, but Max cut her off with a sharp, singular look. "Pack your things, Vanessa," he commanded, the words final and absolute. "Pack enough for the girl and yourself. My men will handle the rest of your belongings in the morning. You're never staying here again." He didn't wait for her to agree. He simply stood there, a dark sentinel in her broken kitchen, waiting for her to accept that her life as a woman alone was over, and her life behind the iron gates of the Caruso estate was about to begin. As Vanessa reached for Jade's small suitcase, she realized that the man everyone feared hadn't just saved her life. He had claimed it, and for the first time, the weight of being owned felt like the ultimate freedom. That a year later, the sky bruised into that same familiar shade of deep violet, and the first snow of the season began to dance against the reinforced glass of the Caruso estate. But as the wind picked up, howling with the same phantom voice that had once driven Vanessa to the brink of despair, the atmosphere inside the mansion couldn't have been more different. The iron gate, that once stood as a symbol of exclusion and fear, was now a silent guardian of a life rebuilt in the warmth. The vast, vaulted rooms that used to echo with a lonely, sterile silence were now filled with the rich, savory aroma of a slow-roasted family dinner and the bright, bubbling sound of a child's laughter. Vanessa stood in the state-of-the-art kitchen, no longer the woman built of scar tissue and iron, but a woman whose edges had softened in the glow of true security. She wore a simple silk dress the color of midnight, her dark hair flowing loose over her shoulders, her eyes reflecting the amber light of the fire rather than the cold flicker of a dying candle. She looked out toward the sunken living room, where the massive Italian leather sofa, the same one she had once shivered upon in her damp coat, now served as a playground. Jade was taller now, her cheeks perpetually rosy, her breathing as clear and steady as the mountain air. She was sprawled across the cushions, her small hands busy helping Max Caruso navigate the delicate pieces of a complex model kit. Max sat on the floor beside her, his charcoal overcoat replaced by a soft cashmere sweater that partially hid the hawk on his neck, though the ink still peeked out as a reminder of the man he had been. The devil of the city was focused entirely on a tiny plastic strut, his large, scarred hands moving with a gentleness that would have shocked the men who feared his name. "Papa Max, you're putting the wing on backward," Jade chirped, her voice full of the effortless confidence of a child who knows she is cherished. Max paused, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners as he looked at her. He didn't correct her. He simply adjusted the piece, his thumb grazing her forehead in a brief, tender gesture. "You're right, little bird," he murmured, his voice a low, warm rumble that had lost its jagged edge. "I'd be lost without you watching my back." The dinner bell chimed softly, a melodic sound that signaled the arrival of their first guests, a small circle of trusted associates who had become more like extended family under this new regime. As Vanessa walked over to join them, Max stood up, his hand instinctively finding the small of her back. The touch was no longer a claim of possession, but a promise of partnership. He looked around his home, the stone walls, the high-tech security, the vast wealth, and realized that none of it defined him anymore. The man with the iron fist, who had spent a lifetime building a fortress to keep the world out, had finally discovered that the only thing truly worth protecting was the family that had walked through his door on a freezing night. He wasn't just a boss or a ghost in the shadows. He was a father and a partner, and as the snow settled peacefully against the glass, it was clear that the storm had not been a curse, but the wind that had finally blown him home. Family, thank you so much for walking this emotional journey with us. We are so incredibly grateful for every one of you. You truly are the heart and soul of this channel, and we love you more than words can say. If Vanessa and Max's story touched your heart today, please join our growing family by hitting that subscribe button and click the bell so you never miss a moment of our tales. Like and share this video. It's the best way to help our family grow and bring more stories of resilience and love to the world. We want to hear from you in the comments below. If you were Vanessa, would you have been able to trust Max after that first night? Also, what do you think was the exact moment Max fell in love with this little family? Let us know where you're watching from. We can't wait to chat with you. Stay warm, stay hopeful, and remember, you are never alone. Until next time.